Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. It was widely expected that South Korea's foreign minister and his Japanese counterpart could have talks yet again at the G20 foreign ministers meeting following after their talks at Munich Security Conference. Though the meeting in New Delhi has become highly unlikely as both are reportedly not participating, efforts to mend ties between Seoul and Tokyo are ongoing. Hurdles to overcome still exist though, including wartime forced labor and the release of contaminated water at Fukushima. How should such issues be properly resolved? And how should the bilateral relationship be dealt with? For an in-depth analysis on Seoul and Tokyo's bilateral ties, what hurdles two countries are facing and how they should be properly solved, we invited Lim Eun-jung, Associate Professor at Kongju National University, on the line. Professor Lim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
Welcome. And we also have Walter Sim, Japan correspondent from the Straits Times, on the line as well. Walter, welcome and thank you for your making time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question to you, Professor Lim. The South Korean government unveiled a plan to compensate victims of wartime forced labor through a public foundation rather than having Japanese firms Nippon Steel Corporation and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries pay damages. Now, could you elaborate more on this plan and why such a plan was even made?
Okay, sure. But probably, unfortunately, we don't probably have enough time to explain every single step of this long story. The victims, they filed their lawsuit first in Japan, back then again in the 1990s. But of course, the Japanese Supreme Court, they eventually decided, rejected and dismissed the lawsuit, and the victims, they brought back the issue to the Korean court. And in 2018, October and November, again, our Supreme Court, they sentenced again the plaintiff. The plaintiff, they won the lawsuit. But however, of course, this is more like a between the victims and then those, Japanese corporations. But as long as there was no really real sign to move on, again, from the Korean government's point of view, we could not wait any longer until this whole issue is totally resolved. So I think the current government, the incumbent government, Yoon Suk-yeol government, they just discussed a lot, I think, and then they found a painful but alternative way to move on, even though it is not a fully satisfactory option to the victims. But I think again the Korean government was trying to find an alternative solution to solve this issue.
Right, so Yoon administration found an alternative way to move on regarding the issue. Now, Walter, the Japanese government has been claiming that all issues resulting from the 35-year occupation of Korea were settled under a 1965 treaty. Has such point of view changed, and what is the Japan's point of view on South Korea's plan?
Well, the point of view has not changed, and Japan has, right from the beginning of this issue, been maintaining its position that all issues related to its colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula, including compensation for requisition workers, were settled completely and finally in 1965 through the agreement that you mentioned that led to the normalization of ties. So this agreement was accompanied with economic aid from Japan of about US $300 million at the time, which would amount to about US $2.8 billion in today's terms. I cannot speak for the Japanese government, and I think any interpretation of what the treaty says in terms of its terms and conditions is best left to the judiciary. But the position that Japan has taken thus far is that it will not be held hostage to what it calls apology diplomacy. Japan says that it has been nearly 80 years since the end of the war, and Tokyo increasingly sees such repeated calls for apology as domestic politicking, as well as being a roadblock for future-oriented ties. Just to look in contrast with Japan's relations with other countries, for instance, say in Southeast Asia that were formerly Japanese colonies, the thinking is that why can Japan move on with those countries but not with South Korea, for instance? This was also stated by the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in his recently published posthumous Japanese memoir. He said that how South Korea deals with Japan relations can change 180 degrees depending on the government in power. A case in point that really bewildered Japanese leaders was how the final and irreversible comfort woman deal with Park Geun-hye's government was soon to be overturned by Moon Jae-in's government. But still, Japan does see South Korea's latest proposal as a positive step forward for bilateral ties. Japan is hopeful that the chill in ties is well over. And as such, if South Korea moves forward with the foundation as planned, I think Japan will really allow non-profit organizations like the K-Danren Business Lobby, as it has been suggested, to make a contribution to the fund. But it will most definitely not let individual companies, let alone Mitsubishi Heavy as well as Nippon Steel that are defendants in the lawsuit, to contribute, because that could be perceived as an admission of guilt or as agreeing to the court order.
Right, so Japan is considering as a positive step forward, though there are some parts that we need to still look into. Now, Professor Lim, during the Munich Security Conference, South Korea's top diplomat met with his Japanese counterpart and called for Tokyo to make a political decision to resolve the issue of how to compensate Korean victims of wartime forced labor. I wonder what political decision is Seoul asking for?
Well, first of all, I probably need to emphasize, there has been disagreement between Seoul and Tokyo. And interestingly enough, Seoul and Tokyo probably agreed to disagree for many actually years. We certainly have had a perception gap. Or like we interpreted sometimes those text in its own way. And again, both parties, have been more like how would you say, patient with that kind of disagreed opinions. But as many things come out, especially ever since the Korea's democratization, comfort women issue too, all this, those issues came out, and with the more democratic governments, of course, Korean governments have been trying to be more responsive to those voices of former victims. We have been more ignorant when Korea was, developing economically, or when we just focused on the economic development. But anyhow, lawsuit is a lawsuit. But the thing is, all this, legal disputes, if we really follow the legal decision, if so, diplomatic relations between the two countries can be really miserable. So that is why probably the two governments, even the Moon Jae-in government too, did not execute the final decision of the Supreme Court, because we didn't want to ruin the long relationship with Japan either. Vice versa, probably even though all those issues were mixed with, for example, like Japan's those trade regulations or like a Jisomia issue, but still we didn't really cross the line, I think. So for now, again, having had this Yoon Suk-yeol government's alternative option, now I think both parties are seriously thinking to move forward to the future. So I guess, again, this political decision means, again, the Japanese government, Japanese political elites, they also need to show some willingness again, to accept this kind of again suggestion or to show their sincere mind again to the victims as well. So I think it's not, of course, the legal thing, but I think our leadership, I think they are trying to emphasize again this diplomatic political efforts, regardless of the domestic political difficulties in there too.
Right. So it seems it's going to be really hard to overcome this issue, but I really hope this issue could be properly resolved in a way, victims and family members could agree, and also in a way the two ties between two nations could improve. Now, moving on forward, Professor Lim, on February 22nd, Japan celebrated its so-called annual Takeshima Day, which refers to the name Japan has given South Korea's easternmost islet, South Tokyo. And the South Korean government to this summoned the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Japanese Embassy in Seoul to file a protest as well. Now, how is this issue affecting the bilateral ties between Japan and Seoul that it's trying so hard to mend?
Well, Korea's position on this specific issue is very clear, very firm. It didn't change at all. So I'll say, this is not a disputable issue at all. As long as Tokyo is under our jurisdiction, and as long as it is a part of our territory, again, it's under our national sovereignty. Again, this cannot be a disputable issue. And of course, we cannot compromise this issue with Japan, regardless of whatever those historical disputes is. Of course, we do have many other historical disputes, but this is not just a historical dispute. It cannot be again disputable issue from the Korea's point of view. Let me just double confirm this specific fact. And having said that, again, of course, this is more like a kind of routine for them too. Again, the Shimane Prefecture, the local government, they annually celebrate this. But whenever they, of course, celebrate this specific day, of course, we cannot but, right? We cannot but show our concerns and anger to this kind of behavior. But that does not necessarily mean that I think affect the fundamental, how would you say, interest between the two countries, because again, this is not a disputable issue. Again, crystal clear.
Right. I mean, all the South Koreans would say this is not a disputable issue, but still, Japan is trying to repeat its sovereignty claims to Tokyo, mentioning it in last year's annual defense paper as well. Now, Walter, what is Japan's stance on the Tokyo issue right now?
Well, I do see parallels in how Japan also considers the issue regarding what Japan calls the Takeshima Islands as an indisputable issue. Japan says that it's an inherent territory, although, well, as has been pointed out, the islands are being administered by South Korea. Japan says South Korea has been occupying the islands with no basis, and as has been pointed out, it continues to celebrate what it calls the Takeshima Day on February 22nd. There are differing interpretations that are rooted in history, of course, but I don't think either country is going to budge. And as what Professor Lim has pointed out, I think both countries in their attempt to forge a future-oriented relations, positive way forward, they should try to set aside this Dokdo Takeshima issue, because it's going to continue to be a thorn going forward. There's no clear resolution in sight. Regardless of all the other issues, be it trade, history, that I think both countries would eventually find a way towards a consensus, a compromise. I don't think either country is going to budge on this. But still, I think what we might want to look out for is whether Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida invites South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol as an observer to the G7 summits this year. If he does, as what a lot of observers are suggesting he would, I think it's going to be a positive step for bilateral ties.
Right, I see. Now, Walter, I'd like to ask you one more thing. Another issue that could be a sticking point between Seoul and Tokyo's relationship is actually Tokyo's plan to release radiation-contaminated water from the quake-stricken Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Now, what is Japan saying about the release of the radioactive water, and how is it willing to proceed so that it does not hurt or damage ties with other countries, of course, including South Korea?
Well, to be honest, I think Japan is going to take offense at your use of the terms radioactive water or contaminated water. Japan will reiterate its position that this water has been treated through this process known as ALPS, or Advanced Liquid Processing System, which removes all radioactive particles except for the naturally occurring and harmless tritium, which Japan says is routinely released into the ocean by nuclear power plants all over the world. Well, Japan is aware of these very strong objections, but Japan also notes that despite these vehement objections, including at the Pacific Islands Forum, the Micronesian president said on February 3rd that his country's concerns have been eased over what he says is Japan's transparency with its willingness to provide data. And this came 6 months after he told the United Nations that he harbored the gravest concerns of Japan's plans. So I think you're right in pointing out that this is going to be a transboundary issue. The responsibility and the onus is definitely on Japan to ramp up its diplomatic efforts to ease the concerns of all affected countries, including in the Pacific Islands and in the region, like what Japan has obviously done with Micronesia. That said, however, I think there is a perception in some quarters of the Japanese government that this could be an issue that is milk for domestic politics, especially when, other potentially affected countries, say in Southeast Asia, are not raising objections to the plan at all. And Japan also notes that this plan is being overseen, this plan is endorsed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. So Japan kind of thinks that any objection is going against the position of the IAEA, which is supposed to be a neutral arbiter in this issue.
Right, I see. Now, shifting gears a little bit here, Professor Lim, Wednesday is March 1st, and President Yoon Suk-yeol is expected to deliver a speech to mark March 1st Independence Movement Day. What message do you believe could be included regarding bilateral ties between Seoul and Tokyo?
Well, actually, ever since the Yoon Suk-yeol government was inaugurated, I did have several chances to travel to Japan, and I met, for example, politicians, lawmakers, or professors, of course, who are studying Korean Peninsula issue, or media people, or some other Korean diplomats, but what all they say was, again, the mood has changed pretty dramatically. Of course, that does not necessarily mean that every single issue is automatically resolved, but certainly the mood has changed. And I do know the Yoon Suk-yeol governments, their elites, they have kept emphasizing the importance of our value. Again, the democracy, freedom, all this, free market capitalism. This is, of course, a part of our regime. So, as long as the Yoon Suk-yeol government is emphasizing the value of Korean democracy, I guess, of course, I do not know clearly what he is talking. Maybe 2 days later, right? But still, I guess, again, President Yoon will emphasize the shared common value of liberal democracy with Japan.
Right, it's really fortunate to hear that the mood is changing. But Professor Lim, still there are many issues to be resolved, right, between the two nations. And both countries, though, they seem to acknowledge the importance of cooperation. That is a fortunate part, with both describing each other as a close neighbor, right, in annual defense papers. How do you think relationship between the two countries will unfold, and how do you believe it should be? Could you briefly explain?
Well, I think we should decouple the issues. Again, these days, the power restructuring is ongoing. Again, the competition between the superpowers, again, the US, China, even Russia. this is really getting increasingly serious. And having had this kind of difficult security situations, again, the Korea, Japan, Korea should not and cannot keep fighting. So as long as we are a neighbor and as long as we do have similar value, I think this is really time for the two nations to find a way for the future and for further cooperation.
Right, though the road could be bumpy, I really hope two nations could find a way to, like you said, to mend ties. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Lim and Walter, of course, for your insights. We appreciate them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.